Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're taking on an absolutely massive topic, decoding the Indian economy. Now, when you think of India, you probably picture booming tech hubs or maybe vast agricultural fields, right? Well, you'd be spot on with both. To truly wrap our heads around this gargantuan ecosystem, we really need to look at it as a dual engine. It's this incredibly complex machine powered by seemingly opposite forces that are actually working together in tandem. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll classify the economy, then we'll explore the power of the private sector, followed by the role of the public sector. Next, we'll dive into rural India's foundation, the massive urbanization shift, and finally, how all of this acts as two sides of the exact same coin. Let's get right to it. Section 1. Classifying the Indian economy. Usually when we talk about an economy, we classify it by occupation. Dividing it up into the primary, secondary, or tertiary sectors. That's your standard textbook stuff. But for this explainer, we're uniquely focusing on two completely different and honestly very powerful lenses. Ownership, meaning public versus private, and habitation, meaning rural versus urban. By zooming in on these two categories, we can really figure out exactly who runs the economy and where it physically operates. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 2, Power of the Private Sector. When I call it an engine, I mean a truly massive one. Get this, 80%. According to our sources, the private sector accounts for nearly 80% of both the country's national income and its working population. That is staggering. From the biggest conglomerates like Tata Consultancy Services and ICSE Bank, all the way down to the smallest village vendor, this competitive, profit-driven sector is doing the vast majority of the heavy lifting when it comes to employment and national output. But where are all these private jobs actually located? You might be picturing gleaming corporate boardrooms, but incredibly, a massive 90% of India's private workforce is in the unorganized sector. The organized sector, which is enterprises registered with the government, following strict rules and regulations, is just a tiny 10% slice. That huge 90% chunk, that includes unlicensed, self-employed activities like owner-manned general stores, handicrafts, and crucially, farmers. Section 3. Role of the public sector. Now, the public sector's responsibilities are incredibly diverse. The government essentially steps in to manage massive infrastructure that private companies usually won't touch, mostly because it takes enormous resources and the profit margins just aren't there. We're talking about running the vast railway networks, postal systems, managing ports, plus crucial civic functions like law creation, public safety, and basic healthcare and education. It literally forms the structural scaffolding of the entire country. Within this public sector, you've got a few different structures, like statutory undertakings. Now, I know that sounds like a dry, abstract textbook term, but it really just means organizations set up under separate acts of parliament. Grounding this in the real world, the Life Insurance Corporation of India, or LIC, and Air India are classic examples provided in our source material. The government doesn't necessarily micromanage their day-to-day operations, but the public totally has a right to be informed of their profits and losses because they're such a fundamental part of the public machinery. There's a really stark difference between these two ownership models. The public sector is driven by a welfare motive. It's funded by government taxes and loans, and its ultimate goal is equitable access for everyone. It actively tries to reduce regional imbalances by setting up industries in backward states. Conversely, the private sector is driven primarily by a profit motive, financed by owners and shareholders, and basically provides goods and facilities only to those who can afford them. One aims for broad equity, the other drives highly competitive, skill-based growth. Section 4. Rural India's Foundation. Let's step out of the corporate boardroom for a second and into the actual geography of the economy, because there's a sharp contrast here too. The difference between the traditional tractor out in the field and the sprawling modern city skyline is the defining physical reality of India's economic landscape. Despite all the rapid tech booms and global headlines, 67% of the population still lives in rural areas. That's more than 2/3 of the country living in villages, where lifestyles rely heavily on natural resources, faith, and traditional cultural practices. It is the absolute bedrock of the nation. But this massive rural foundation faces some very unique, almost invisible challenges, like disguised unemployment. This happens when more people are working a job than are actually required. Imagine a family plot of agricultural land where 20 farmers are working. If you withdraw 6 of them from the work and the total crop production doesn't fall at all, well, those 6 people were disguisedly unemployed. They look completely busy and engaged, but their actual economic contribution is zero, simply because there's just excessive population pressure on the land. Adding to that disguised unemployment is seasonal unemployment. Because agriculture is so dependent on the time of year, and because a lot of rural areas lack proper irrigation facilities to grow more than one crop a year, agricultural workers are often forced to remain completely idle for 3 to 4 months out of the year. It's a massive structural hurdle that severely limits rural income. Section 5. The urbanization shift. Urban areas, on the other hand, are marked by incredibly high population density, completely man-made built environments, and non-farming activities like trade, commerce, and advanced services. And the financial draw is huge. Per capita income in urban areas is about 2.5 times higher than in rural areas. But, as you'd guess, it brings severe new problems. We're talking higher incidence of air and water pollution from vehicles and industries, and a very modern kind of joblessness known as educated and industrial unemployment, where the supply of highly skilled people outpaces the available jobs. There's also a wildly stark social contrast between village life and city living. In rural areas, people live in close contact with nature. Life is simple, and relationships are super intimate and face-to-face. In a village, everyone knows everyone. Contrast that with the urban environment, a completely man-made setting, a super fast-paced and highly complicated life, and a heavy reliance on formal, temporary relationships where social status is determined not by birth, but by merit and intelligence. Section 6. Two sides of one coin. So we have the profit-driven private sector versus the welfare-driven public sector, and the traditional rural foundation versus the fast-paced urban shift. It might seem like completely divided worlds, right? But they are absolutely inseparable. The private sector desperately needs the heavy machinery, communication networks, transport, and banking systems that are largely built and managed by the public sector. Private investment literally only grows when public infrastructure investment paves the way. Conversely, the public sector relies heavily on the diverse goods and services produced by the private sector to actually meet the collective wants of the nation. They completely rely on each other to keep the engine running. And this entire ecosystem is highly dynamic. It's constantly evolving. On the habitation side, the urban population steadily increased from just 17% in 1951 to 33% by 2011. On the ownership side, government policy saw a massive shift in 1991 when the number of industries strictly reserved for the public sector was slashed from 17 down to just 8. The momentum over the decades is clearly shifting heavily toward urbanization and privatization. So here's a thought to leave you with. As the highly competitive, profit-driven urban private sectors continue to explode in growth, how will the traditional, rural, and welfare-focused public foundations that originally built them adapt to survive in this new era? It's an incredibly delicate balancing act, and how it plays out is literally going to define the future of over 1 billion people. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, stay focused, and I'll catch you in the next one.